I read books in different languages. My first language is Spanish, but most of what I read is actually in English. I also regularly read books in French and Portuguese, and less often Italian and Catalan. My next reading language is going to be German. I have been working on my German a lot in recent months, and my goal is to be able to read my first whole book in German later this year. I'm so used to reading in 6 different languages that I had forgotten how hard reading in a new language is, but it is also so rewarding. Imagine being able to read books from other countries or cultures different from your own, but without having to rely on translations. I have nothing against translations, and I think translators do a great and necessary job. And I do have to rely on translations when I read Russian novels, for example. And my reading experience with those has always been great. But from experience, I can tell you that nothing beats reading a book in its original language. Please let me know what languages you either read books in or what language you would like to try in the comment section below. I would love to hear from you. Today, I'm going to give you my tips for reading books in foreign languages. These tips are pitched for people who have never read anything in a foreign language before, those who have tried but failed, and those who already do it but would like to get better at it or start with a new language. I belong to the third group because I have only recently started with books in Italian, and as I said, I am planning to start with books in German in the next few months. So I have some recent first-hand experience that I would like to share with all of you. There are really no big secrets about reading in another language. Everyone can learn to do it. It takes time and dedication. Unless you have to learn a new alphabet or writing system first, you can start reading in your target language from day one. If your first language is English and you want to learn to read, say, in Arabic, Korean, Mandarin, or Hindi, you will need to learn the writing system first. And that could take days, weeks, or months. But if you want to read in Spanish or French, you start with a great advantage because you will be familiar with most of the letters. You can also use reading as a way to learn a foreign language, but I wouldn't start with that. I recommend listening to the language first, take lessons, get yourself a tutor, use the language learning app, but also listen to the language daily. There are podcasts, YouTube videos, streaming services, movies. It has never been so easy to learn another language. By the way, I do have another channel where I teach Spanish, so I'm going to link to that here and in the description box if you're interested. The important thing is that you start listening to the language before you try reading books in it. You can start by reading shorter material, and not just articles, but social media posts or even tweets. When you decide you want to read books, just be prepared not to understand every word. Think about it. Unless you are a genius with an enormous vocabulary or read very simple prose, you probably don't understand every single word you read in your first language either. When reading in a foreign language, it's important that you adjust your expectations down a little bit, at least at the beginning. Try to get into the flow of what you're reading. Even if there are whole sentences that you don't understand, as long as you are getting the gist and can follow the story along, keep reading and don't stop to look up words. If you then keep coming across the same word or sentence structure that you don't understand, or you're not able to even guess what it might mean from the context, then it is time to stop and look it up. When you do look things up, try to get the definition in the original language. Instead of using a bilingual dictionary that will give you a translation, look up the definition of the word. So instead of translating the word, read its definition in the original language and see if you can understand its general sense from the context. Even if you're not sure you understand the word, read the sentence again and see if it makes sense in its context. And this takes me to my next tip, which is to resist the temptation to translate. When you learn another language, your goal should be to be able to think in that language first so you can then speak it and understand it. It doesn't make sense to translate things even in your head when you're having a conversation, because that would only slow you down to the point that the person you're talking to will lose interest. Also, if you translate everything, you will probably end up speaking nonsense. Very rarely is it possible to translate into another language word by word, and it is highly unusual to use the same number of words in the same order in 2 different languages. Therefore, I recommend learning whole concepts or expressions rather than translating word by word. And this also applies to reading. If you stop at every sentence or paragraph to translate translate what you have just read, you will soon get tired and bored with what you're reading. That is not sustainable for a whole novel or even for most short stories. It is very important to get into the rhythm of what you read. To me, whenever I start a new book, I like to spend at least about an hour reading nonstop so I can get into the style, the language, see what the author is trying to do, and become invested in the story. This then makes it easy to come back to the book later on and keeps me motivated to finish it. In general, I prefer my reading sessions to last at least 1 hour. I can read in shorter bursts too, but only when I'm already into the book. Now, when it comes to reading in a foreign language, my reading sessions tend to be a bit shorter than that. As I said at the beginning, reading in a foreign language is hard, so I recommend becoming a bit more flexible with your reading habits. It is always better to read a little bit every day, or most days, than to try to cram in as many hours as possible into one single reading session. Reading a whole book is always an accomplishment to be celebrated, and finishing a book in a foreign language is an even greater achievement. My next tip is to quit if you are not enjoying yourself. There are so many different genres and writing styles that you are guaranteed to find something you enjoy in your target language. So if you cannot make sense of what you're reading, don't think that you will never be able to read in your target language. Chances are that you are simply reading the wrong book. And I do have a couple of tips for choosing books in a foreign language. First of all, try something contemporary. Reading in a foreign language is already hard enough when you try something written in the current language. So why add another layer of difficulty by picking up a classic that is not going to be written in the kind of language that you have been studying? Classics are hard to read even in your native language, so I wouldn't start by reading classics. Once you have a few good contemporary novels under your belt, you can venture out and explore classics. But don't make that your first adventure. Secondly, pick the kind of book that you enjoy in your first language. If there is a specific genre or style you enjoy reading, do a little research and find something similar in your target language. Some people recommend reading children's or YA books, but I would only recommend that if it is something that you already do in your first language. Why? Because children's or YA novels are written in a relatively simple language, but unless you read that kind of thing in your own language, and I know many adults do not try it in your target language because you might get bored and lose motivation. I have similar thoughts about short stories. Some people think that reading short stories in a foreign language might be less challenging because they are, well, shorter, but I am not convinced. For one thing, some short stories are incredibly complex, but aside from that, not everybody likes reading short stories. I, for one, generally prefer longer fiction, so unless you are an avid fan of short stories, I would go for novels instead. And avoid those bilingual short story collections because you might be tempted to read the translation, which will be counterproductive. If you take your time and persevere, you will not only learn a lot of new words and expressions, but multiply your options of reading material. No matter where you are in the world, it is easy to buy books in different languages online. And if you want book recommendations in different languages, you can click here for my Polyglot video.